I'm Tanvi Madan. I'm Director of the India Project here at Brookings and also a Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program. I have with me here today two of our postdoctoral research fellows, Rush Doshi and Sharan Grewal. We're also looking for two more postdoctoral fellows starting next year. And the applications for that are available on our website, brookings.edu, and you can look under the Careers tab. The application, just a reminder, the application deadline is January 4th, and all the details for what you need to submit are online. We have both of them here today, Rush and Sharan, to talk to us a little bit about their experience here as postdocs at Brookings and what it's like to be a postdoc in a think tank. Rush, I'm going to start with you. Why did you think about applying to Brookings?
Thanks so much. So my research focuses primarily on Chinese foreign policy and grand strategy. But one of the things that appealed to me about Brookings was that I could not only pursue that research line here, but I could also develop additional expertise across other areas. I've had an opportunity at Brookings to learn from people who work in a wide variety of geographic and functional areas, and all of that's really enhanced my understanding of how policy works, how the policy process unfolds, how to influence policy, and specifically just better knowledge about areas of the world that weren't really part of my graduate program. In addition, Brookings has a really well-deserved reputation for collegiality, and I feel like I've been included in a lot of projects, a lot of opportunities at Brookings, and that in particular makes me very grateful to be here.
Sharan, what about you? What got you to Brookings?
So most of my research has been on Tunisia and why it has succeeded as the one democracy from the Arab Spring. But what I've learned in my research is that Tunisia's transition is still fragile, and there's a lot the US could do to help support Tunisia's transition. So I came to Brookings to try to learn from the experts on how to influence that policy discussion about how the US could support Tunisia. And I came here to learn from Brookings experts, how do you write for a policy audience? How is it best to shape policy and what points of the policy process? And to learn from them how I could also contribute to the discussion about how to support Tunisia's transition.
So our bread and butter here is in-depth policy research. Let's talk a little bit about your research. Sharan, what was your dissertation on and what are you working on now?
So the dissertation was looking at why in Egypt the military staged a coup against the transition in Egypt, whereas the military in Tunisia supported Tunisia's transition. And through interviews in both countries, as well as through 3 surveys of military personnel, what I found was that in Egypt, you had this very powerful military under autocracy that of course lost power under democracy, providing the grievance for a coup. Whereas in Tunisia, you had a very marginalized and neglected military that actually gained from democracy, leading them to support the democratic transition. And so what I've done in the dissertation is to look to Egypt and Tunisia as these theory-building cases, and then also to test the theory cross-nationally, showing that among all democratic transitions, how the military had been treated prior to democracy shapes whether they will support or oppose the democratic transition. And what I've been trying to do this year at Brookings is to turn this dissertation into a book by adding one final chapter, which looks at when you have these hard cases, when these democracies are inheriting these powerful militaries like in Egypt, what could the international community do to try to still get to democracy even in those cases? Are there recommendations we can learn, for instance, from Latin America that we could apply both for the transitional government and for the international community to apply in those hard cases?
Rush, your research focuses on a different part of the world. It's also functionally somewhat different. So tell us about it, your dissertation, and what you're working on currently.
Sure. So my dissertation was on the question of whether, after the end of the Cold War, China had what you could call a grand strategy that was integrated across military, political, and economic means of statecraft. So my argument was that it did have such a strategy, that strategy really came into formation after the trifecta of Tiananmen Square, the Gulf War, and the Soviet collapse, and that strategy then changed again after the 2008 financial crisis. In its first phase, between that trifecta and the crisis, we saw a strategy that I call blunting, which is designed to basically undermine certain elements of American leverage over China, specifically military, political, and economic leverage. And then in the next phase, after the financial crisis, a more confident and resurgent China pursued what I call a building strategy designed to cultivate those same forms of leverage, but this time over China's neighbors, in pursuit of what we would call hierarchy or a sphere of influence or hegemony, depending on how you want to define those terms. And that dissertation relied heavily on primary source Mandarin documents, specifically party documents, as well as a social, scientific, and counterfactual analysis of Chinese behavior across all of those domains. And so that was a fairly academic project, but it had a pretty important policy implication. One of the reasons I came to Brookings, like my colleague here was that I wanted to find a better way to basically translate that into an audience, into the policy audience, something that people would be able to understand and digest. So my work at Brookings has primarily been about turning this project into a book, but also making sure that that book has a policy-relevant chapter which says, what should U.S. strategy be, given that this is the logic of Chinese strategy? And I've tried to tease that out through some great conversations with my colleagues. And there are a number of other projects I worked on, a number of other collaborative efforts I've been able to get involved in. So while I came to Brookings to work on sort of making this book a more policy-relevant project, I've gotten a chance to work on a lot of other things as well.
So both of you mentioned that you'd like to have foreign policy impact. Do you have advice for other doctoral candidates who are close to finishing their PhDs, other than finish their dissertations? Do you have any advice for them about how they can have foreign policy impact?
Sure. I think the first thing I would say is it's helpful to be in Washington for a variety of reasons. You can sort of meet some of the people who will be interested in your recommendations, and you can find a way to engage with them, not just for today, but for the future. Second, it's important to find out how to write for a policy audience, which is of course entirely different from the kind of writing that we perfect in graduate school and for academia. There's been some research to suggest that there are different kinds of evidence that people in the policy community find compelling versus academics. It's important to get a sense of what that is and an experience for how to talk that language up front. And I think third, it's also useful to get perspective. Oftentimes the issues we think matter the most, or the kinds of justifications we think are the most convincing in the academic world, don't always apply as easily when you're talking to people on Capitol Hill or people in the executive branch or even your fellow colleagues. And so getting a sense of the context, that is what other people are thinking about when they think about policy, really helps you get in the mind of a policymaker to be more effective in pitching your ideas.
Rush. Sharon.
I would just add one thing, which is that there's actually a lot you could do even before coming to DC in terms of having a policy impact. So you could, as a PhD student, write for the Washington Post and the Monkey Cage. You could write, for instance, for Political Violence at a Glance or for War on the Rocks. All of these somewhat academic policy blogs actually have quite a big readership in DC. So there's a lot you could do to influence policy even before coming to DC.
And the only one piece of advice I have is apply for the Brookings postdoctoral fellowship. Once again, just a reminder that the applications are due on January 4th, and you can find the details of the application on our website at brookings.edu. Thanks, Rush, and thanks, Sharon.
Thank you.
Thank you.